Are woolly mammoths still roaming the frozen tundras of the north? That's probably not a question you hear asked every day, because of course not. Mammoths are extinct, right? They disappeared off the face of the earth thousands of years ago. These majestic creatures once dominated the frosted plains and grassy plateaus of North America and Eurasia, thriving and migrating in large herds across the endless landmasses. But things suddenly changed for them. Around the end of the Pleistocene epoch, they began slowly dying off. The Northern Hemisphere saw its prehistoric rulers vanish. But did they all go the way of those before them? Like other Ice Age creatures, were mammoths unable to contend with a quickly changing world, or did they manage to find refuge in the unchanged landscape of the North? Over the recent past centuries, there have been rumors of these majestic walking carpets still being sighted from time to time. And in today's episode, we look into some of these claims to find out for ourselves if the woolly mammoth is truly still roaming the valleys of the North. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins, and thank you for joining me on this subarctic mystery on the Moonlight Lore podcast. Cola F. Fowler's report. First brought to life through the May 5, 1889 edition of the Philadelphia Press, then reprinted a month later by the Daily Sitka Sentinel in Alaska, we gather a story shared to the world by an old fur trader by the name of Cola F. Fowler. For over a decade, the man had ventured into the interior of Alaska, starting in 1877 as an agent for the Alaskan Fur and Commercial Company. His mission was to travel around the state, purchasing and trading furs and fossil ivory with the local indigenous populations, then taking that merchandise back to a small trading station set up near the small city of Nome. It was when he was nearing the end of his work there in 1887 did Fowler find himself traveling north from Kodiak Island, back up to the headwaters of Snake River, a waterway that empties out into the Bering Sea at Nome. It was on this journey he had met with a chief of a local Inuit band, who welcomed him with open arms with hope to sell the ivory tusks and meat his hunters had accumulated over the past months. As per his job description, Fowler took this opportunity to peruse their collection and see if there was anything that stood out to him. Unfortunately, most of the ivory seemed to come from regular walrus tusks that had been cleanly cut from the kill, and very few seemed to catch his eye. That was until he spotted the rack of ivory resting near the end of the pile he was shown. To his astonishment, they were incredibly large, stretching roughly around 15 feet in length and weighing up to, what he estimated, was 250 pounds each. Now, mammoth tusks weren't necessarily uncommon to find dotting the frozen wasteland of the north, but these ones in particular stood out to him. They were in tremendous condition, as if the past few thousand years hadn't even touched them. But upon further inspection, his curiosity piqued when he discovered the remains of decomposing flesh and traces of fresh blood at their base. Looking up from this find, he questioned the chief where he and his people had discovered these remarkably well-preserved fossils from, to which the chief assured them they were not found in the ice like most others were, but rather harvested by a party of young hunters from his village. According to the chief, just 3 months prior, the party had tracked a small herd of the beasts only a mere 50 miles from their encampment, where they were also able to bring down an old bull and cow. Fowler's mind was racing. He couldn't believe this band of hunters had managed to track, hunt, then kill such mighty animals once thought to have gone extinct thousands of years ago. He begged the chief if he could speak to the leader of the hunting band to hear his side of the story. Fowler needed to be certain he was understanding the significance of this discovery. The leader of the hunting band approached him and was more than willing to share the details of their escapades in the north. The man told him they were scouring along a dry watercourse for ivory, which they had already found a considerable amount of. Earlier in the day, one of their own had ventured further up ahead of the main party to search for wild game, but came rushing back a half hour later claiming he had discovered signs of the big teeth having been in the area. They had migrated down from a lofty plateau farther inland to feed near the hot springs. The party of hunters knew they couldn't pass up the opportunity to bring down such a massive animal, so they marched to the spring with their weapons at the ready. As they drew near to the area, they heard an ear-shattering shrill trumpet-like call bellowing out across the tundra. They couldn't quite see the creatures yet, as they needed to crest the short hill ahead of them to gain a vantage point, but before they could reach the top, the ground shook with the trembling might of heavy footfalls fast approaching. The hunting band was overwhelmed with the sight of a large woolly creature bounding towards them, obviously on the warpath. The men scrambled, running in fear towards the safety of the trees around them, all except two. The leader of the group, along with the scout who had first spotted the creatures, stood their ground. Their determination for the hunt was unmatched compared to those who had traveled with them. The two, minding the path on which the beast was stampeding towards, took aim with their large caliber muskets and fired. The two bullets hit their target, one hitting near the heart and the other directly into the skull. It staggered for a bit, struggling to stand and make its way back to its herd, but not before long it collapsed to the ground in defeat, the last breath of air retreating from its lungs as it slowly died in the crimson snow. It wasn't long after bringing down the animal did the hunters get to work in harvesting what they could. And while doing so, another one of the big teeth had apparently appeared, a smaller one than the first and presumably its mate, but the hunters were able to bring that one down as well without very much issue. Of course, Colafer stood amazed at the tale that had been strung before him. He curiously asked the hunter if he would be willing to sketch a picture of the creatures he and his men had killed, so using a nearby stick and the soft clay at their feet, the young man drew a crude sketch resembling that of a woolly mammoth. According to him, it stood at least 20 feet in height and 30 feet in length, but had smaller ears and larger eyes. Its trunk was long and slender and had 6 tusks in total. 4 were like the tusks of a boar, one on either side of each jawbone and measuring 4 feet long before coming to a sharp point. The other 2 were the ones resting on the rack Fowler had already inspected. The young hunter then also added the fact of it being fully covered in long, coarse, reddish dun-colored hair. If we were to take Cola F. Fowler's 1889 report and the words of the Inuit hunter as truth, it may change what we know about Ice Age extinctions. The crude sketch of the creature the young hunter had made in the clay seemed to have resembled that of a four-tusker, or perhaps a eubelodon, ancient ancestors of the elephant who once lived throughout the Miocene epoch in North America. A further interesting note to add to this mystery is the fact any literature or pictures of mastodons or woolly mammoths before 1890 had only ever showed them having 2 curved tusks. Any discovery of the four-tusker or the eubelodon wouldn't happen until the 20th century. Mastadon sightings in northern British Columbia. During the 1880s and 1890s, there were a few newspapers claiming large woolly creatures like the mastodons were being sighted around northern British Columbia and southeastern Alaska near the Stikine River. At this time, much of the northern parts of the province were unexplored, and to this day it remains a wild and untamed land. Not very many people could say they have journeyed into this neck of the woods, but those who do claim wild animals of tremendous sizes roam here, hiding among the mountains and forests, evading human interactions. In February of 1893, the retired Juneau Free Press printed a bizarre story in its papers about a group of Stikine Aboriginals who claimed to have witnessed massive, overgrown creatures roaming the forests. Later descriptions would imply what these hunters were encountering were the once thought to have been extinct mastodon. One of their earliest stories they've shared with the world is while out hunting in the early spring, one of their lone hunters came across a series of large, sunken tracks pressed firmly into the wet moss covering the ground. They were the size of salt barrels, and there were many. The man decided to follow the path which led further past the forest and into a grassy plateau, where he came into full view of his prey. However, despite being one of the tribe's bravest hunters and more than capable in taking down wild game all on his own, when he observed the giants feasting on the grass and foliage, he was struck with a heavy sense of terror and dread and swiftly retreated back towards his camp. The description he later gave of the beasts he witnessed were that of being as large as post-trader buildings, with great shining yellow-white tusks and mouths large enough to swallow an entire man with a single gulp. He further stated that those same kind of animals can be found all across the northern country, but have only ever been discovered as frozen bones and ivory tusks. The Old Hunter's Search. A strange story was once shared by the French consulate in Vladivostok. M.L. Gallon tells us a Russian hunter may have seen a pair of giant creatures back in 1918, who he maintained looked very similar to pictures of modern-day African elephants he had once seen. In the second year I was exploring the taiga, I was very much struck to notice the tracks of a huge animal. I say huge tracks, for they were a long way larger than any of those I had often seen of animals I knew well. It was autumn. There had been a few big snowstorms followed by heavy rain. It wasn't freezing yet, the snow had melted, and there were thick layers of mud in the clearings. It was in one of these big clearings, partly taken up by a lake, that I was staggered to see huge footprints pressed deep into the mud. It must have been 70 centimeters across the widest part and 50 centimeters the other way, so the spoor wasn't round but oval. There were 4 tracks, the tracks of 4 feet. The first 2 about 4 meters from the second pair, which were a little bigger in size. Then the track suddenly turned east and went into the forest of middling-sized elms. Where it went, I saw a huge heap of dung. I had a good look at it and saw it was made up of vegetable matter. Some 10 feet up, just where the animal had gone into the forest, I saw a sort of row of broken branches made. I don't doubt by the monster's enormous head as it forced its way into the place it had decided to go, regardless of what was in its path. I followed the tracks for days and days. Sometimes I could see where the animal had stopped at some grassy clearing and then gone forever eastward. Then one day I saw another track, almost exactly the same. It came from the north and crossed the first one. It looked to me as if they had trampled about all over the place for several hundred meters, as if they had been excited or upset by their meeting. Then the 2 animals set out marching eastward, one following some 20 meters behind the other, both tracks mingling and plowing up the earth together. I followed them for days and days, thinking that perhaps I should never see them, and also a bit afraid, for indeed I didn't feel I was big enough to face such beasts alone. One afternoon it was clear enough from the tracks that the animals weren't far off. The wind was in my face, which was good for approaching them without them knowing I was there. All of a sudden I saw one of the animals quite clearly, and now I must admit I really was afraid. It had stopped among some young saplings. It was a huge elephant with big white tusks, very curved. It was a dark chestnut color as far as I could see. It had fairly long hair in the hindquarters but seemed much shorter on the front. I must say, I had no idea there were such big elephants. It had huge legs and moved very slow. I've only seen elephants in pictures, but I must say that even from this distance, where we were about 3,000 meters apart, I could never have believed any beast could be so big. The second beast was around. I saw it only a few times among the trees. It seemed to be the same size. A discovery far more valuable than gold. In the late evening of a cold September day, 1998, a herd of mammoths were apparently spotted by a group of gold prospectors in the Sakha region of Far East Russia. News of this sighting was passed on to hominologist Professor Dmitry Bayanov, who then duly passed it on to French cryptozoologist Jean Roche, who later learned a gold prospector by the name of Oleg Rusin, who along with 5 other prospectors with him, all witnessed a herd of 12 mammoths off at a distance of around 80 to 90 yards away. The prospectors had been surveying the area for weeks and had never come across any creatures like this before. They honestly weren't sure if what they were looking at was real or not, but as they stopped and stared and observed the creatures migrating across the tundra, they were certain their eyes were not betraying them. The vast area they were in was far from any sort of human habitation, which may explain why these creatures had never been spotted until then. But the hairy giant spotted the group of men staring at them, and then the herd quickly stampeded up a small creek, only to then disappear in a rather large expanse of larch trees. An escaped convict's discovery. Although it no longer exists today, the natural history magazine known as The Zoologist, created in 1843 by Edward Newman, published an odd interview with a Russian convict named Cheriton Batmashnik in 1873. He claimed to have encountered living mammoths living in a valley of the Aldan in eastern Russia. After being caught for smuggling and sentenced to work in a mine in Siberia, he managed to escape towards the Amur River. Eventually, by following herds of migrating animal tracks, he came upon a hidden valley, hemmed in by cold, rocky cliffs from all sides. As he descended the rocky terrain, he discovered the first touch of warmth he had felt in years as he wandered into a lush, overgrown hidden land full of animals and fauna. As the day was growing dark, Cheriton decided to stop here for the night and ignite a fire to keep him warm. But that's when he heard something moving in the trees behind him. The pistol he had on him was his only source to protect himself, so firing a single shot into the air, he hoped it would scare away any potential predators that might be lurking nearby. But unfortunately for him, this only angered his stalkers, as a herd of massive beasts came stampeding towards him, sending him fleeing into a small rock crevice to find shelter. He watched as massive, hairy shadows ran past him, and when it was all over, emerged from his hiding place to discover giant round footprints left behind in the dirt. Come daylight, Cheriton decided to follow the massive imprints to where they led him to a small body of water. A cave on the other side caught his eye, and believing he would find better shelter there, he snuck his way towards its mouth and peered inside to a sight he would never forget. A fully grown mammoth had already claimed the cave as its home. It was 4 meters tall and 6 meters long. It was covered in reddish-black wool, and its tusks were about 3 meters long. Not wanting to disturb the giant before him, the man decided it best to creep away and find another location to make shelter at. In the coming days, Cheriton claims to have seen about 20 mammoths in total wandering the valley, but all of them were adults and no calves. They seemed to be quite peaceful, never showing any kind of aggression towards him or any other animals they were near. The twist he then added, however, was that he also claimed to have seen a serpent-like creature who lived in the lake nearby where the mammoths were grazing. The serpent had tremendous fangs and was covered with thick scales. From a distance, he observed it to have stretched roughly 10 meters in length and was beyond amazed when it decided to attack a mammoth who came for a drink at the watering hole. He watched as the two behemoths struggled for survival, crashing together in the murky water, but the massive mammoth managed to escape the monster's clutches and retreated from the shore. As amazing of a tale this is, and just how much praise it garnered after it was shared to the public, it unfortunately was later exposed as a hoax, thought up by the creative minds at the New York World newspaper. The killing of the last mammoth. In mid-October of 1899, McClure's magazine published one of its most controversial articles to date, which caused an influx of letters sent to the publishing office asking if what they had printed was really the truth. Some had argued the article was nothing more than a fantastical hoax meant to draw the attention to the paper, while others hailed it as the landmark event of the century. Finding himself snowed in the interior of Alaska at Fort Yukon, Henry Tuchman found very little to keep himself entertained for the weeks he was stranded for. It was 1890, and the Klondike Gold Rush was still several years away, so he found himself spending many days and nights listening to the stories told to him by the local tribesmen. It was during one of these nights Henry found himself showing a man who he identified as Old Joe a book about various subjects. When he turned the page and the paper revealed a picture of an African bull elephant, it caught Joe's attention and spurred another tale. According to the excited man, he revealed that he had once seen one of these creatures, gesturing with his hand towards the distant mountains. Henry, of course, looked at the man with confusion. This was an Aboriginal elder who had never once left the state, let alone the country, so the mere idea that he had witnessed an elephant at any point in his life was certainly bordering on the line of believability. But Old Joe insisted that he had once come across one, so looking to humor his friend, Henry pushed him to share his story. Long ago, several summers back, Old Joe and his son, Soon Tai, were traveling up the Porcupine River in search of wild game. Unfortunately, Soon Tai had passed not long ago, but Old Joe fondly remembers this trip and the adventure they shared. Breaking off from the confluence of the main river, the pair journeyed up a stream towards the mountains but found it impossible to traverse. Soon Tai ventured ahead in search for a path and discovered a large cave leading into the rocky cliff that closed off into a narrow passageway which led to the other side. Old Joe was happy he found the path, but admits his son was far braver than he was, because when his son showed him the cave, he was astonished to find it was full of giant bones, far larger than his body. He wasn't sure what the bones might have once belonged to, but they pushed ahead, and the two managed to come out the other side of the tunnel. Taking a deep breath of fresh air and letting his nerves settle, Old Joe held his son's shoulder, silently telling him with his eyes he was proud of him for discovering the path and leading him through it, but also not to do that again to him. The two would remain in this general area for some time, until one day Soon Tai points to a territory off in the distance, suggesting the two of them should journey in that direction to hunt beaver. Old Joe shook his head and claimed it was the Devil's Country, an unforgivable area teeming with danger. Well, Soon Tai wasn't deterred. He knew they would be able to find more than enough beavers to end their hunt there, so after much convincing, Old Joe relented, and the father and son duo started towards the Forbidden Land. After about a day of travel, the pair came across a massive long lake and made the decision to spend their time constructing a crude raft to cross it in lieu of walking around. When they had finally finished their boat and had set sail onto the calm, cold water, the two paddled their way towards the end, only to find a sight that astonished Soon Tai, but terrified Old Joe. A T-Kaikoa was bathing in the shallow waters alongside the shoreline, using its massive nose to splash water up onto its hairy body, as its massive long teeth that stretched out from its head slashed at the surface of the water, creating waves and ripples that echoed towards the center of the lake. The two men at this time had waded over to the thick river reeds that covered the shore, so that they might hide themselves from the creature and observe. While they watched and waited for the beast to move along, Soon Tai eventually lost his patience and naively stood out from the reeds and raised his rifle in hopes of killing the monster before them. Old Joe was too slow to react, and before he could stop his son, he fired on the woolly monster, forcing it to rise on its thunderous four legs. Soon Tai was too slow to crouch back down and hide from the creature again before it spotted the young man. It charged at the pair, stomping down the vegetation in its path, forcing the two men to take off fleeing into the thick woods where the creature could not follow. Their adventure ended that day. Both were too shaken to stay in the valley any longer, afraid the T-Kaikoa would find them. Old Joe finished his story telling Henry to be wary about searching for such a beast. If he tried, he would likely not be so lucky as he and his son had once been, and he would not have the opportunity to share his own tale. Henry Tuchman stared at his friend with a stunned disbelief. What he described, the T-Kaikoa he called it, really did sound like an elephant, but a species thought to have gone extinct long ago. He wasn't sure what to make of it, but from the dour look on his friend's face, he knew better than to prolong the conversation. Old Joe was obviously reminiscing about his lost son, so instead the two bid farewell to one another and went their own ways for the night. By the next day, the idea that a creature lost to history was still roaming the earth nearby was something Henry could not get out of his mind. His friend Paul visited him that morning, who he shared the strange story with, and he was just as intrigued. Having lived in the area and flown as a pilot for most of his adult life, Paul knew the general area Old Joe must have been speaking about, and as soon as that piece of information was revealed to Henry, the notion of traveling to the Devil's Country to find the Lost Mammoth was one he couldn't ignore. Without much convincing, Henry managed to get Paul to agree to lead him there, and on August 2nd of 1890, the two men traveled up towards the Forbidden Land, where monsters were said to roam. As luck would have it, Henry believed they had discovered the very same tunnel through the mountain described to him by Old Joe. It was roughly 200 feet long and wide enough for 3 men to walk side by side, but most notably of all, there were giant bones scattered throughout the entirety of the cave. It must have been some sort of predator who had once dragged the bones inside, as a mammoth likely wouldn't have fit while it was alive. But nonetheless, the tunnel did lead them to an opening on the other side of the cliff from where they once were. At this point, it dawned on Henry that so far the story Old Joe had told him days ago was accurate. The tunnel full of bones existed, so he expected the rest of it to just be as true. On August 29th, a full month after their expedition began, the two men crested a small rock cliff to discover a sight that made their eyes bulge from their sockets. There in a little clearing just a short distance below was a lone mammoth, feasting on the moss and grass surrounding it. The two couldn't believe their eyes, an animal once said to have gone extinct thousands of years ago, living and breathing among the hidden valleys of Alaska's interior. But their reconnaissance and reason for their journey wasn't due to some love of nature or fascination with the unexpected. Their purpose was to hunt, to prove to the world creatures like this are still around, and could still be hunted. Now knowing the location where the mammoth dwelled, the two men went to work in felling a number of trees, harvesting their logs to create a giant structure that they would use to lure their prey. By mid-September, the pair were nearly finished putting together their trap. They then installed wooden pegs into two of the tallest spruce trees they could find and created small hunting stands hidden away from the structure down below. The pair then went out in search of the mammoth, ready to lure it to their ambush. Upon finding the creature resting in a clearing, they fired shots at it, forcing the mammoth to wake in a rage and charge at the two men. They ran for their lives, bolting across the forest floor, desperately trying to keep ahead of the charging mass behind them. With great speed, Henry arrived at their structure first and lit it with a quick strike of his match so that the smoke would bellow into the sky, attracting the animal to it. The pair would then climb the pegs they had hammered into their respective trees and waited for the beast to arrive. As the mammoth came rushing, noticing the smoky stack of logs before it, it used its massive tusks to grab hold and lift the structure into the sky before slamming it back down to the ground. Both Henry and Paul were amazed at the sheer might of the creature, but their astonishment didn't prevent them from carrying out their mission. From their stands, they rained down lead bullets into the skull of the mammoth, who seemed increasingly annoyed that it couldn't find its attackers. It was too transfixed on the burning structure to notice they were in the trees above it. As blood began pouring out of its mouth and ears, the majestic creature's strength began to falter. It attempted to retreat from the area, stumbling back and forth as it moved. Eventually it fell, and the two hunters clambered down their trees to begin the harvest. According to Henry Tuchman, the pair then set up camp in the area, spending some time roasting and consuming the tough meat. Along with cleaning the bones and skin, they also measured the lungs and heart. It wasn't until the end of January did the two men decide to return back to civilization after burying the remains of the creature in the frozen ground, hoping upon their return they would be able to find a buyer for such a prized discovery. Tuchman then later claimed that he struck a deal with Mr. Horace Conradi for millions of dollars for the purchase of the corpse, and that the Conradi mammoth was indeed discovered and killed by him in Alaska, and not discovered in a block of ice in the Yukon like Conradi claims where he discovered it. After the issue went public, the influx of outrage at the killing of one of these magnificent lost animals overwhelmed the mail of McClure's magazine publishing office. So much, in fact, that they had to come clean. The narrative written by Henry Tuchman was apparently nothing more than a simple work of fiction. The man had never killed the mammoth in the interior of Alaska, and they wrote they had no intention of misleading the public like they had. There has been zero evidence brought forth to suggest this story was at all true, which enforces the idea that a mammoth still alive in this day and age has nothing more than just fantastical storytelling, which makes the question on if mammoths are still alive in the north today more or less unrealistic. There have been plenty of discoveries of fossilized and preserved mammoths in both North America and Siberia to make it seem like mammoths had recently been around. One of the best examples of this is the story of Little Yucca, one of the best preserved mammoths in the history of paleontology. A juvenile female mummy of a small mammoth discovered by local tusk hunters in Siberia in August of 2010. It's believed she had fallen into some water or a swamp and was unable to save herself from eventually drowning. But because of this, her corpse was so well preserved, scientists have managed to extract cells from her body in hopes to clone her, but so far have not been successful in that area. Perhaps most of the stories we hear or read about mammoths living somewhere up north are simply just people observing preserved mammoth bodies and mistaking them for living creatures. I'd like to add a little note here describing a time when Reverend Shelton Jackson discovered ancient Mastadon remains in the Arctic Circle in 1898. Apparently, he found the legs of one of these ancient animals jutting out from a frozen glacier, the rest of the body still entombed. He made a remark that the meat was so well preserved that he cut a slab off the lower legs of the beast and tossed it to his sled dogs, who devoured it in seconds as if it was fresh. For the most part of our understanding, it is widely believed mammoths had gone extinct 10 to 14,000 years ago, leaving very little room for any lingering generations to have survived to our present day. Now, that was the belief until the early 90s, when we found solid fossilized proof that mammoths had actually lasted a lot longer than we had believed. Dr. Sergei Vartyanya, along with two fellow researchers from Russia's Wrangel Island State Reserve, discovered in 1993 the fossilized remains revealing mammoths had thrived on Wrangel Island as recently as 2500 BC. This was the same time the famous pyramids of Egypt and Stonehenge in England were being constructed. Unfortunately, though, the 130-kilometer-long island wasn't home to regular-sized mammoths that we tend to picture, but rather a dwarf species that only ever measured up to around 6 feet in height. Still, though, very recent in terms of the timeline of our planet's history. I also want to point out the writings of Chinese historian Sima Qian, who lived between 145 and 86 BC. In his writings, he claimed animals present in Siberia included giant boars, northern rhinoceroses, and bristly northern elephants. Now, there's a chance he may have been referring to frozen preserved carcasses of these creatures, but it may be an interesting point to ponder why he would write about such creatures as if they were still alive in the general time period he was. Most today are undecided on if the overhunting of the woolly mammoth or the warming climate are to blame for the mass extinction of the animal, but most tend to agree that they have all gone the way of the dinosaurs. The dream where our world could still be called something similar to a Jurassic Park is one that many people have. The idea of ancient, once extinct creatures roaming the world with us today is one that many are fond of imagining. But sadly, the likelihood of this dwindles with each passing year. With climate change on the rise, it's likely we will see more and more modern animals disappear from the face of the earth, which makes the theory that certain other ones, like the woolly mammoth, who had once lived thousands of years ago, could have continued to survive long past due their expected extinction dates seem rather improbable. Whether or not any of these stories spoke the truth is nearly impossible to say. Very few offer any real evidence to explain them, and those that do often provide evidence to the contrary, stating what we already know, that mammoths likely had gone extinct long ago. However, this podcast is certainly no stranger to stories of secret paradises said to hold mysteries and strange animals somewhere in the frozen north. Perhaps somewhere out there, far from any kind of human habitation, the mighty prehistoric mammoths evade our curious questions, thriving peacefully deep in hidden territories as ancient relics of Mother Nature's past. So, are you guys convinced? Or are you still in the encampment that the woolly mammoth, like so many of other ice-aged animals, perished long ago? It's certainly a wild question that leaves you wondering if you are right or not. I personally believe there are more mysteries hiding in the Northern Hemisphere than we typically like to give credit to, and the mystery on if mammoths are still alive or not is one that could have some merit to it, but I don't stand convinced. Certainly, it is possible that mammoths had lived long past their expected extinction date, but we may never truly know for sure. It's just one of those mysteries that will likely just go left unsolved. And honestly, people are often surprised at just how commonplace the bodies and bones of mammoths actually are. I know in Canada's territories, you could go to almost any gift shop and find something made of ivory tusks taken by a long-dead behemoth. The animal was so abundant that it's almost unnerving how such a large and dominating population of a species could have been wiped out completely. Maybe there's a lesson there for humans, but that might be a question for another time. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I had a lot of fun putting it together. If you did happen to like the work I did and like listening to the other episodes on the podcast, I would like to ask, in exchange for the hours of content I produced, if you could leave the podcast a 5-star review or share it with your friends and family for me. 'Tis the season of giving after all, and by giving me that gift, you help the show grow and make me a happy little elf. If you wanted to give me a present this year, either reviewing or sharing is fantastic, but donating to the Patreon is even better. All it costs is $5 a month to sign up, which really only amounts to a cup of coffee a month. So if you think this content I've been producing for you for the past few years have been worth a cup of coffee a month, please consider donating to the Patreon. As well as all the free episodes you get on the main feed, by donating you also unlock all bonus episodes I do each month on the Patreon. I got some pretty interesting topics on there, the most recent one being devil monkeys living in Alaska. So if you enjoyed this episode and the mystery of creatures living in the frozen north, you're gonna love that one. Right now, I don't think I have any news to report. The Spotify wrap-up was just done, and I found out that I have listeners in 56 different countries on Spotify, which is kind of crazy to be honest. But at the same time, it's so amazing that so many of you guys enjoy listening to me talk for some reason. So thank you all for making that nice little surprise possible this year. But yeah, I suppose that's it for this episode. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season, and I hope you all stay safe out there during this time. As always, I will be back with you in 2 weeks' time with a new episode. Which day would that be? Oh, that's the 26th. Well, maybe I'll release the next episode a day or two early so it can come out for Christmas. So until then, stay tuned for any updates I might post on the Instagram or main feed, and I guess I will see you next time. Happy holidays.